All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei. Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda. Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz, Moshe, Ben Avram, David. We thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month in the schus of Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha and Adam Yudit Ben Zev for dedicating the Shurim this month in the schus of all of our tefillos being Niskabel. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira Miriam Grossman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Ira's father, Melech ben Azriel, and Avi Zeisman in commemoration of the yahrzeit of his mother, Ziva Bas Avram. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, Jeremy and Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jeremy and Rachel Lassin for Refuah Shlema for Nisim ben Sima and Sophia Liba Bas Rachel Yehudis, who are both having minor surgeries today, and to thank Ellen and Sue Meyrowitz for dedicating this shir today in honor of all of those who davened for Sue's refuah. May she continue in Meretz Hashem to have that refuah in the years to come. I will say with that, let us begin. So we have a lot to do today, a beautiful, beautiful daf. Today's daf is Tzadik Tes 99, and we are picking up, is it echoing? No, it's good. Okay, so today's daf is Tzadik Tes 99. We are picking up on Tzadik Ches Amud Beis, Amr Rabbi Yaakov Minar Pekod, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 lines up from the bottom. So just to reorient ourselves, we left off with what I think was an absolutely fascinating question. So imagine, we'll use me as an example. I say to a Shaliach, I want you to go ahead and sell off, Zabin li liska. Go ahead and sell off for me a liska of land, and the Shaliach instead does more. So let's use just contemporary examples of this. I say to the Shaliach, I own multiple acres of land. Sell off an acre of land for me. Okay? And the Shaliach sells two. So what's the Shaila? The Shaila, Rabosai, is how do we view his actions? Do we view his actions as essentially he's done what I've asked him to do, but what else? He's added to it. So what he did, in other words, 1 acre of that is correct. The extra acre is a hosafa. But the fact that he added on doesn't go ahead and negate the fact that what? He did what I asked of him. Or do we say, no, I told you to sell an acre. You sold 2 acres. You violated the framework of our agency. And whenever a shaliach violates the framework of the agency, essentially, he negates the agency. So in the lashon of the Gemara is, do we say, Mosif al dvaravu, that the shaliach did what he was supposed to do, but he added on? Or do we say, no, ma'avir al dvaravu, he violated the terms of the agency, and therefore halacha lamaisa, what he did was null and void? A really fascinating question. So Amar Rav Yaakov minar pekod mishvid Ravina Tashma, Amar balabayis l'shlucho. Interesting case. So the Gemara tries to prove it for the following situation. A man says to his shaliach, Reuven says to his shaliach, give our guests, Reuven has guests over. It's Yom Tov, he has guests over. And Reuven says to his shaliach, give our guests a piece of food. I'll call it a piece of meat. V'hu amar tlushtayim. And the shaliach said to the guests, you could take 2. Now in this case, Reuven was very specific. 1 piece of meat per guest. Not Hungarian, that's for sure, right? So one piece of meat per guest. Okay. Now what happens? The shaliach went ahead and gave them 2. Vehei natlu shalosh. And the guests took 3. So what's going on over here? What's the halacha? Kulan malu. Now we'll say the case in question is where it turns out that what? It turns out that the meat was consecrated meat. It was hektish. So now the Gemara says everyone committed mi'ilah. The balabais, Reuven committed mi'ilah, the shaliach committed mi'ilah, and the guest committed mi'ilah. Now we'll say this is very fascinating. Now remember, what's happened over here? The shaliach has added on to what the mishalech, to what the principal said. So the Gemara says, "I amit bishlama mosif al dvarav havi mishomachi balabayis mo." So if you say that at the end of the day, when a shaliach does more than the principal asked him to do, he's not in violation of the agency. Rather, what do we view him as? Performing more than the agency. So then it makes sense, Rabbi saying, that the balabayis committed mi'ila as well, because the shaliach was executing the agency that the balabayis commanded him to. But I will say, if you say that when a shaliach goes ahead and what? And adds on to the agency, he's effectively violating the agency, then what? Then balabayis ma'o. Then why would we view the balabayis as having committed me'ilah? In other words, Rabbi say, this is actually quite interesting. When a shaliach acts outside of the parameters of his shlichus, he's no longer representing the mishaleach, right? He's no longer representing the principle. So see what's happening over here? So in this case, the balabayis told the shaliach, give the guest one piece of meat. The shaliach gave the guest two pieces of meat. The guest ate 3 pieces of meat. And what's the halacha? It's a me'ilah party. Everyone has committed me'ilah, right? Everyone's committed me'ilah. So the Gemara says like this. So here's a case of where the shaliach added on to the parameters of his agency, and yet you still see that the balabayis is considered to have committed me'ilah, which means that the shaliach is considered to be representing the balabayis, which shows you that what? Even when a shaliach goes ahead and expands on the scope of his shlichus, he is still considered to be representing the interests of the balabayis. I think Mar said, but 1 second. Because if you say that when a shaliach adds on to the parameters of his agency, he's no longer representing the balabayis. Instead, he's gone rogue. He's on his own. If that's the case, then what? Then the balabayis should not be committing mi'ilah. Incredible. Vatana will say. So that sounds like we're saying, so at this moment in the Gemara right now, what it sounds like is that halacha l'maaseh, even when a shaliach expands on the parameters of his agency, halacha l'maaseh, he is still representing the principle. So the Gemara says, "V'hatanan hashliach she'asa shlichoso balabayis ma'al lo asa shlichoso shliach ma'al." So we'll say, but yet we learned elsewhere that in general, when a shaliach is representing the balabayis, if the shaliach executes his agency as he's supposed to, then the balabayis commits mi'ilah. But if the shaliach goes out on his own, then halacha l'maaseh he hasn't committed mi'ilah. So what's the case here? Listen to this. Tlu achas midaito shabalabayis, the achas midaiti v'shaklu inhu tlas. So we'll say, see, here's what happened over here. See, watch this case, and this is fascinating. So Ruvain the balabayis says to his shaliach, give our guests a piece of meat. Okay, now what happens? So now, the shaliach is tending to the needs of the guests. The guests are seated. Shaliach says to the guests, Ruvain, your host, would like to offer you a piece of meat. I'm your shaliach for this evening. I would like to offer you a second piece of meat. And the guests help themselves to a third piece of meat. So in this case, Rabbi said, everyone's interests are being clearly represented. So Reuven, even though Shaliach ultimately is adding on, he's making it explicitly clear that the first piece of meat is from the Balabayis Reuven. And therefore, in this kind of case, halacha l'maisa, Reuven, the Mishaleach, the principal has committed mi'ilah. The Shaliach himself has committed mi'ilah. And the participants in the Su'udah have committed mi'ilah, for they have eaten that third piece of meat of their own volition. Incredible. So I just want to point out, so we have no answer. In other words, we're asking a very specific case. And remember how this all started. I appoint a shaliach to go ahead and sell an acre of land. The shaliach sells 2 acres of land. So what happened over here? Do we view the shaliach as going rogue? He's not listening to me. So what's the halacha when a shaliach goes rogue? What's the halacha? His act he's terminated. Sounds very like right? In other words, we'll call it the agency is terminated, right? In other words, he's no longer acting on my behalf, he's doing his own thing, and therefore I am not bound by his actions? Or do we say no? At the end of the day, he did fulfill what I asked him to do. He sold an acre, but he also went a bit above and beyond and sold an additional acre. But at least what I asked him to do is binding. So we haven't answered it yet. So here we go. Tashma, Kesuvos samana machra shava mana v'dinar. Supposed to say, and the Gemara tries to prove this from the Mishnah. So listen to this. A woman has a ksuva that's worth a mana, 100 zuz. Umachra shava mana v'dinar b'mana, and she sells a field that's worth 101 zuz for 100 zuz. So she goes in and she undersells a field. So what's talacha? Michra batal. Ultimately, her sale is void. Her sale is void. So it says, my love to Zabin Shama Mana V'Dinar B'Mana V'Dinar. Are we not talking about a case where she took a field that was worth 101 zuz? And remember, her ksuv is only 100 zuz. So she took a field worth 101 zuz, and she sold it for 101 zuz. My love to Zabin Shama Mana V'Dinar B'Mana V'Dinar. Umay B'Mana. What does it mean when Mishnah says she sold it for a mana? Mana Shalah. It means she took a field that was worth 101 zuz and what? Sold it for 101 zuz, but she herself is only entitled, of course, to 100 zuz. Umay afilu hi omeres achsir es adina liyarshim bedinar vafilu hi omeres achsir es adina liyarshim. So even if she says, listen, I know I took a field for 101, and I know I'm only entitled to 100. I know I sold it for 101. I'm going to return this additional dinar, ultimately again to the Yarshim. So the Gemara said, "V'dina mikarkoi, v'katani michra batal." And I will say, what's talach over here? Talach over here is if a woman who has a ksuva of 100 zuz takes a field of 101 zuz, even if she sells it for 101 zuz, and even if she says that what? I'm going to return 1 zuz back to the Yarshim. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? The mechira is batal. Why is the mechira batal? What do you see from here? What do you see from here? That a shaliach who goes beyond the scope of his agency, or in this case, her agency, ultimately, their shlichus is batal. Their shlichus is batal. No. Lo, bida ozil. That's not the case. The case here I will say is where she undersold it. She took a field of 101 zuz and she sold it for 100 zuz. That's the problem over here. Daf of Tzadik Tes. Actually, look at Rashi before you go. Rashi b'da ozil umishum hachi michra batal titasa shemachar shavmana v'din ramana. I will say this is how we originally learned this case. The problem in this case over here is she took a field that was worth 101 zuz. And what did she do? She undersold it. When she undersold, so remember, the way we saw this in the Mishnah was, she never had a right to this field, right? Remember again, a woman has a right to property not in excess of the value of her ksuva. So if her ksuva is 100 zuz, she has no claim, no right, no abilities in a field that's worth 100 zuz. And the problem over here is she undersold it. Top of Tzadik Tes. So 1 second. Habi the Seifa b'da ozil, Habi Reisha b'da lo ozil. So here's the problem. We assume now, if the Seifa of the Mishnah is talking about a case where halacha l'maisa, she undersold a field, then we must assume that the Reisha, the first part of the Mishnah, is not talking about a case where she undersold the field, because it doesn't make sense for the Reisha and the Seifa to be talking about the same type of cases. After all, the Gemara says, K'diktani Seifa. What did the Seifa say? Arba meos zuzi. If ultimately again her ksuva was 400 zuz, machra lezebemana ulezebemana ula achron yafemana v'dinar bemana sha'achron michra batal v'shalkula michra kayim. So also remember again, this was the last case. This was the case of a woman who has a ksuva of 400 zuz. And remember, what did she do? There's multiple transactions, right? So field 1, 100 zuz good. Field 2, 100 zuz good. Field 3, 100 zuz good. Ula acharon, the fourth field that she sold off was worth 101 zuz. And what happened? She went ahead and she sold it for 100 zuz. In that case, I will say, what's the halacha? Michra batal. That last transaction is batal. So the Gemara says, V'shal kulan Michran Kayim. And ultimately, again, all of the other ones, ultimately the transaction is good. So we'll say, so here's the problem. So now what it sounds like is, are all of the cases of the Mishnah talking about situations where she undersold property? But if that's what we're talking about, why do both the Reisha and the Seifa have to teach me a case of an undervalued sale? To which the Gemara says, lo. Reisha v'Seifa b'da'ozil. So the Gemara says, both the Reisha and the Seifa are talking about a case where she undervalued the sale. The Seifa, hakamash balan, taima da'ozil b'diyasmi, aval b'didei michrakayim. Shabbos say this is very interesting. The Seifa, which is this last case, Shabbos say, watch, this is actually fascinating. So the Seifa case was, she has a ksuva 400 zuz. 400 zuz. Remember again, what is she doing? She's selling off multiple fields. Field 1, 100 zuz. Field 2, 100 zuz. Field 300 zuz. Field 4, what does she do? She sells off a field that's what? Worth 101 for 100. That last sale is batal. The chiddush in that case says, listen to this. Let's switch it around a little bit. Let's say she sold field 1 for 100 zuz. Good. Field 2 for 100 zuz. Let's say field 3 was worth 101 and she sold it for 100. What would be the halacha? We'll say it would actually work. Why would it work? No problem. We'll just take it off the next one. In other words, the case in the Mishnah, the reason why the last transaction is batal is because it's the last transaction. In other words, had she undersold the field somewhere in that chain a little bit earlier, it's not good, but no problem. We'll just offset it against the remainder of the ksuva. That's the chiddush there. That's what it means. Ava bedida michrakayim. So the Gemara said, 1 second. But the truth is, I could have learned that from the Mishnah as well. From the Reisha. After all, it was the Reisha. Remember again, what was the case of the Reisha? Case of the Reisha was, her ksuva was worth 200 zuz. So we'll say this was the case. Remember, she's a good businesswoman. So what does she do? She takes a field that's worth 100 zuz, and she sells it off for 200. So what's the halacha? Or shava masayim b'mana. Or about say she takes a field for 200 zuz and she sells it off for 100 zuz. Either way, what's the halacha in both of these cases? Niskablu ksuvasa. So I will say. So in other words, I know the concept that essentially we have a bit of leverage. If she makes a transactional mistake with the sale of the land, essentially, as long as there's outstanding ksuva money, who bears the brunt of that transactional mistake? She does. So, for example, if she takes a field, a perfectly good field that's worth 200 zuz, and she sells it for 100 zuz, what do we say? No problem, right? In other words, you got your ksuva. You had an item of value of 200 zuz. You bungled the transaction. You're left holding the bag. You're done. So, in other words, so I'll say, so I already know this concept that if she messes up transactionally, as long as there's outstanding ksuva monies, we actually let the transaction stand. It's fine because she bears the brunt of it. So I'll say, that's the same case as where she messes up with field number 4 versus, in other words, the reason why when she messes up in field number 4, that last transaction is batal is why? Because we have nothing to offset the loss against. Had she bungled transactions 1, 2, or 3, the transaction would stand. Because we would say what? Right? The negative effect of the transaction will just be offset against the remainder of the ksuva. So why are you teaching me the same concept twice? To which the Gemara says, here we go. Ma'udatema, hasamudi istalkale mehai beis alagamri. Sirabo say, in the case of where what? In the case of where halacha lemaisa, she takes a 200 zuz parcel of land and she sells it for 100. So it's easy for us to wash our hands of that, right? Because everything is kind of taken care of in one fell swoop. You got your parcel of land, you're done. However, aval hacha, nigzer mana rishon, ata mana achron. Sirabo said, this is interesting. I might have thought that in the case of the 4 fields, that where she's selling off it's 4 different transactions. I might have thought that in that case, if she messes up with any of those fields, the entire transaction should be batal. Out of concern that what? that if we allow transactions 1, 2, or 3 to stand when she messed up, what could you easily come to do? Validate transaction 4 as well. So remember again, let me just go back to this just for a moment. In the case where she's selling off multiple fields, right? So remember, the way the Mishnah frames it is, she has a 400 zuz ksuva, sells off field 1 for 100, good. Field 2 for 100, good. Field 3 for 100, good. What happened with number 4? She took a field that was worth 101 and she sold it for 100. What's the halacha? That last transaction is batal. But I will say, but again, what we've established is it's only because it's the last transaction. And why? And therefore, why is it batal? We have nothing to offset the loss against. But if she did that same thing, took 101 zuz field and sold it for 100 in transactions 1, 2, or 3, what will be the halacha? It's kosher. Why? Because we could offset it against the remainder of the ksuva. The chiddush is, I might have thought that even if she does it in 1, 2, or 3, it should still be batal. Why should it still be batal? Lest you confuse it with the case of if she did it with number 4. Kamash Malan, no. Kamash Malan, in transactions 1, 2, and 3, if she messes up, fine. We're just going to offset it against the remainder of the ksuva. But if she messes up transaction 4, that's going to be batal for the simple reason that we have nothing to offset it against. Incredible. V'ikei da'amri, I will say, others explain an alternate version of this. So the Gemara says, "Halo tibay lecha heicha da'amar lei zil." I will say. So okay. Let's go back. We still have our original outstanding question. We'll say again. What's our outstanding question? I ask a shliach to do X. Shliach does X plus Y. I sell him to sell off an acre of land. He sells off 2 acres of land. So what's the shaila? Very simple. Is it mosif or is it over? Do we view the shliach as, did the shliach do what I asked him to do? Did he do what I asked him to do? On one hand, yes. He just what? Did more. So do we say you did what you did what I asked you, but you did more, and therefore what you did is still effective, or no? I asked you to do X and nothing more. The moment you shaliach add into X, you terminate, right? You undermine the tenets, the framework of our agency, and therefore we're done. We no longer have an agency relationship. That's our shayla. So here we go. V'ikei da'amri. So we'll say now back to this discussion. V'ikei da'amri. So v'ikei da'amri. Halo tibay lecha. Heicha da'amar le zil zabin li liska. V'zabin li kura. Devadai mosef al dvarav havi. So what says this? The Gemara says, I think we can all take it for granted that halacha l'maisa, if I tell the shaliach, sell for me an acre, and the shaliach sells for me 2 acres, that certainly the agency is still valid. Why? Because essentially he's done what I've asked him to do. He's just what? He's gone a little bit further, or a lot further, right? He's gone a little bit further. So where's the shaila? So the Gemara says, Kiti ba'lecha, the amrle zil zabin li kura, va'azil v'zabin li liska. Rabbi say, here's the shaila. The shaila is when I tell him to sell more and he sells less. That's where the shaila comes up, right? I ask the shaliach to sell for me a core, right? Let's say I ask him to sell for me 2 acres and he sells 1 acre. What's the halacha here? So we'll say, listen to this. Mi amrinad amrle di tavalacha avdi lacha di lo mitztarchi lacha zuzi lo matzis hadris vei. So we'll say, this is great. On one hand, the shliach can say to me like this: listen, I did you a favor. Why did I do you a favor? Right? This is the shaliach talking to me. Right? So I told the shaliach, sell 2 acres. The shaliach sold 1 acre. So the shaliach said, listen, I'm helping you out. I did you a favor. How so? Because right now, we'll say it's actually interesting. From the Gemara's perspective, there's only one reason a person is selling land, right? You never sell real estate. Why are you selling real estate? Why? You're strapped for cash. So the shaliach says to me, listen, Silber, I know you told me to sell 2 acres because you're strapped for cash, but I figured, shaliach says, let's start with 1 acre, see if that provides you with enough cash, because once you sell land, then what? You're not getting it back. In other words, you could always cash in the second parcel if you see you don't have. Both say, by the way, Only a Jewish shaliach does this, right? The shaliach's going to tell you what you need, right? Just do what I asked you to do, right? I didn't ask for editorial comment. If I want an opinion, I'll ask for an opinion. No, I thought about what you asked me to do, and I realized that, again, this is the better way to do it. Incredible. So again, so on one hand, that's the kind of the shaliach is making. I know you told me to sell 2 acres, but the truth is I was thinking about it, and I think you could accomplish what you want to accomplish with 1 acre. And because again, if you sell off now, that's done. Versus sell off 1 now, see if you have enough cash. If yes, great. If not, we could always sell off the second one later. Oh, Dilma, Amarle, Lo Nechale Deliv Shishtari Ilai. Well, see, on the other hand, I can say to the shaliach, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't want you to sell off piecemeal. Why not, I will say? Because when you sell piecemeal, what happens? You have a whole bunch of different documentation. Now suddenly you're going to have a shtar for this, a shtar for this, a shtar for this. And remember, the person who sold the field all the parties involved have to go ahead and keep track of the shtaros. So the principal say, I wanted you to sell off both parcels at once because I did not want to have to keep track of multiple shtaros. So I will say, so this is the tension over here. So I will say, so I just want to point out, this version is posits that everyone agrees, if I ask the shliach to sell off 1 acre and he sells off 2 acres, that he's mosif. He's mosif. The shlichus is still good. He's not considered to be undermining the shlichus. Rather, what? He's simply adding on to it. Where's the machlokes, or where's the potential issue? I ask him to sell off 2 acres. He sells off 1. Shliach says, I'm doing you a favor because maybe you won't need the cash. And once you sell the land, you can't get it back. And I say, no, I don't want multiple real estate transactions. I just want 1 transaction. 1 transaction because I do not want the proliferation of shtaros. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Chanina Misura. So Tashma, let's analyze this. Tashma, Nasan lo dinar shel zav va'amar lo habei lechalak. We'll say it's a great case. I give the shaliach 1 gold dinar. Now we'll say Rashi points out over here that 1 gold dinar is ultimately worth 6 sloim. 6 sloim. Okay, so I give him a gold dinar and I say to him, "Va'amar lo havei li chaluk. Buy me a shirt. Buy me a shirt. I want you with this gold dinar, these 6 sloim. I want you to buy me a shirt." And what happens? V'halach vehevi lo b'shalosh chaluk or b'shalosh talis. And what happens? The shaliach goes out and he buys me a shirt for 3 sloim and a talis, a cloak for 3 sloim. So remember again, I only asked him for a 6 selah shirt. That's what I asked him for. He comes back with a shirt for 3 sloim and ultimately again a talis, a cloak for 3 sloim. Now both say, now the unwritten part of this case is, and what happens? It turns out that the gold dinar that I gave him was hagdish. Therefore, what's the halacha? Shnehem ma'alu. We have both committed mi'ilah, both of us being me and the shaliach. So, 1 second. So now what's happened over here? The shaliach went ahead and added on to the parameters of the shlichus. Right? I asked him for a shirt. I asked him for a shirt for 6 line. He got me a shirt, he got me a wardrobe, right? He got me a shirt and a cloak. I didn't ask for that. So the Gemara said, umosif al dvarav havi, mishum hachi balabayis mal. See, if you say that when a shliach adds on to the parameters of his shlichus, he's still operating, he's still functioning as a shaliach, then it makes sense that both the shaliach and I commit, then that's why the balabayis has committed mi'ilah, because my shaliach is my extension, and therefore again, I've committed mi'ilah. But if halacha l'maisa, when the shaliach expands on the parameters of the shlichus, he's gone rogue, he's no longer considered to be acting on my behalf, then what? Then why do I, the shaliach, the mishaliach, the principal, why do I have the status of having committed mi'ilah? What's the case? The aisile shava b'sheish. So I said it's very interesting. What's the case over here? The case over here is where the shaliach got me a 6 selah shirt for 3 sloim. That's a good, it got me ready. It's a good shaliach, right? He got me the shirt for half price. With the I see the shava sheish b'shalosh. So Hachi shaliach amaymal. Well, if that's the case of us, I said, in other words, what the Gemara is saying over here is, I asked him, what did I ask the shliach for? What did I ask him for? I asked him for a shirt. Rabbi, so remember again, I didn't just ask him for a shirt. What kind of shirt did I ask him for? A 6 sela shirt. So what's the case? What happened over here? He got me the 6 sela shirt, but he got it for me for what? For what? For 3 slime. For 3 slime. Okay, great. So now in essence, the shaliach did perform his agency. He did what he was supposed to do, right? He got me the 6 sela shirt, granted for 3 slime. If that's the case, then why did the shaliach commit mi'ilah if he's acting as my agent? Says the Gemara, the shaliach committed mi'ilah, why? A talis. Because remember again, the shaliach bought me the talis, I didn't ask for the talis. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, what about the seifa? Rabbi Yehuda says, Af bazeh balabayis lo ma'ol. They both say, even in this case, the balabayis did not commit me'ilah. Why not? B'bnei sheyachal lomar chaluk gadol hayisi mevakish v'ata vesili chalak katan v'ra. So here's the problem. The balabayis can say to the shaliach, I wanted a nice shirt. You got me an inferior shirt. In other words, I wanted a shirt for 6 slime. You got me a shirt for 3 slime. But 1 second, the Gemara says, Myra. But that's not how we just set it up. How do we just set it up? That the shliach got me what? A 6 sela shirt for 3 slime. So what happened? To which the Gemara says, Rab damim. But it's fascinating. The shaliach says to the shaliach, I wanted you dafka to spend more money. Why? Because had you bought me a shirt for more money, the shirt would have been worth more money. In other words, the mishaleach, the principal, is not happy with the fact that the shaliach went ahead and got him an inexpensive shirt. It was 6 marked down to 3. I dafka want 6 because these items appreciate. So an item that's worth 6, ultimately again over time will become worth 12. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, the mishaleach, the principal, is unhappy with what the shaliach did. Tegenami diktani, Rav Yehuda bekitnis sheshnei malos. So we'll say we always come back to this case. Everyone agrees in the case of legumes, that both the mishaleach and the shaliach have committed mi'ilah. Why? What's with kitnis? Amud beis, shakitnis besela, the kitnis bepruta. Because we'll say kitnis is the kind of thing where halacha l'maisa, no matter what measure you buy it at, it's always going to be locked into the same price, which is actually a quite fascinating idea. Look at Rashi. Tap Rashi tzadik testimony base. Shakitnis besela. Rashi says, "He kitnis bepruta lefi cheshben prutas besela the mishum dezabin tfei lo mosli gabe." We'll say so. Kitnis is one of those interesting things where halacha l'maisa, whether you buy in bulk or you buy a smaller amount, the price is set. To which the Gemara says, Shmamina. Good. So the Gemara says, Hey, Dami, what's the case? If it's a place where they sell by approximation, then Allah said that would seem to indicate that what? The more you buy, perhaps the better discount you will get. Papa, what's the case? Ba'asra the kaili bekani. No, it's a place where they go ahead and they measure it out. They measure it out. Amrle kana bepruta. Ultimately, again, each vessel, each kana is sold at a pruta. Okay, so it's clear. So I just want to point out, we still have not answered our question, right? We're still trying to figure out our core question, which is, when a shaliach goes ahead and expands on the parameters of his shlichus, halacha l'maisa, do we view it? We'll say 2 words to remember. What are the 2 words to remember? Mosif, he's adding on, but the shlichus is still intact, or over. He's in violation, and therefore the shlichus is dissolved. So Tashma, here we go. Haisek Kesuvos arba meos zuz. If her Kesuvos 400 zuz, machra lezeba mana lachra yafe mana v'dinar b'mana shel achron bato v'shel kulan michran kayim. Shabbos say this is very interesting. All roads keep leading back to this case. So remember again. This is Rachel, right? Rachel is a ksuva, 400 zuz. So what does Rachel do? She engages in 4 different transactions. So transaction 1, a field for 100 zuz, and again, the field is worth 100 for 100. Transaction 2, field worth 100 for 100. Transaction 3, field worth 100 for 100. Transaction 4 is where we run into trouble. What happens to transaction 4? She takes a field that's worth 101, and what does she do? She sells it, she undersells it. She sells it for 100. So what's the halacha? First 3 transactions are good. Last transaction is batal. Now both sides. Look at Rashi. Rashi's almost ready. Rashi says, "V'hahacha dilazabuni ba'arba meya shajra umachar l'rishon b'mana tahanu zabin lekura v'zamaliska." We'll say, watch this. This is absolutely incredible. So the Gemara says, you know what this is a case of? Let's analyze this. Rachel has a ksuba worth 400 zuz. She is essentially acting as a shaliach of the Yisomim to sell off property. What did the Yisomim tell her? Sell off what? 400 zuz. Right? Because that's the value of the ksuba. So we'll say, so what does she do? She ultimately takes 400 zuz and she sells it off for 100. In other words, I will say, what she's doing in this agency is, the way the Havamina is, she's underselling the property. So I will say, this is the case of going ahead and where the Shaliach asks you to sell 2 acres, and what do? You sell 1 acre. I will say, remember again, just to reorient, we're holding. In this iteration of the Gemara said before that we are taking it for granted that if the Shaliach, if the principal said to the agent, sell off 1 acre, and the agent sells 2 acres, we're taking it for granted now that what? What's talacha? Michrakayim. That works. Right? We view it as mosif, not over. In this iteration, in this Ikeda Amri, what we are trying to figure out is what? Is halacha l'maisa, the Shaliach said sell off 2. Sorry, the Mishaliach, the principal said sell off 2. And the Shaliach sold off 1. Shaliach says, listen, I know you're strapped for cash, but I don't want to sell because you can't walk that back. And Mishaliach says, I don't want multiple shtaras. Shabbos said, the Gemara said, well, look at this case. Here, effectively, the Yisomim said to the woman, to Rachel, we'll call the widow, go ahead and sell off 400 zuz of land. What does she do? She sells off 1. Granted, then she sells a second one, but when you look at each of those transactions in a vacuum, she's effectively, quote unquote, doing less than what she was charged to do. And yet, what's the halacha? Mechrakayim. We only run into a problem with transaction number 4 because she's underselling a parcel of land. But halacha l'maisa, otherwise, the underselling of the parcel, the underselling of the parcel works, which would then seem to indicate to us that in a case where the Mishaleach tells the Shaliach, go ahead and sell 2 acres, and the Shaliach sells 1 acre, that the transaction should be valid. To which the Gemara says, no. Kida Amrav Shisha Reid Rav Idi Bikatini. Hachanami Bikatini. No. What's the case, Rabbi say? The case, which is interesting, because this is what I envisioned this case in the beginning, but the Havamina is different. So Rabbi say, the way the Gemara originally, the Havamina is that she's selling off 4 contiguous pieces of property. So she could have sold it all at once, but she doesn't. To which the Gemara says, Kashlam Bikatini. Rashi says, Lo hayu sados halalu yachad ve'ein ru'uyin la'adam echad de'me'ikara adayti da'achin shliach. We're not talking about 4 contiguous fields. We're talking about 4 independent fields. So by definition, because they are independent, non-contiguous fields, the pashtos, they would have never been part of the same transaction. So because that's the case over, so there was never the possibility of one comprehensive transaction. So pshita amar la'echav v'lo l'shnayim. So we'll say, so it's obvious in a case, look at Rashi, pshita amar l'shlucho. So machar li beis karmi sado say la'echav v'lo l'shnayim. So we'll say, okay, so we're not finished yet. So now watch, we're transitioning a little bit. So we'll say, so we still haven't answered our question. Right now, remember, for our purposes, the question still extends both ways. Right? So case number 1 is where the shaliach expands on the parameters of his shlichus. So do we say he's mosif, but the shlichus is still intact, or he's over, he's in violation of the tenets of the shlichus, and therefore the shlichus is dissolved? That's question 1. What's question 2? Question 2 is where the shaliach does less than the mishaleach asked him to do. So once again, do we still say the shlichus is intact? Or do we say, no, you deviated, and therefore the shlichus is batal? 2 outstanding questions. Expand on it a little bit more. So pshita, so we'll say it's obvious in a case, if I say to my shaliach, I say shliach, I want you to sell off property. Sell off 2 acres to one person. To one person. I say to him, le'echad v'lo l'shnayim. I say, and I dafka say to him, sell off the acre to one person, not 2 people. So what's the halacha? I will say, and he goes and he sells it off to 2 people. Obviously, again, he's in violation of the agency, and therefore his actions are void, because I told him dafka to 1 and not to 2. So the Gemara says, so good. What happens if I just tell the shliach stam? Shliach, go ahead and sell off for me 2 acres. Sell off 2 acres to me. Right? Sell it off to one guy. Now, so what's the difference in this case? I say to one guy, but I didn't say what? Not to 2 guys. Right? I just say sell it off to one guy, but I didn't add in that last part, not to 2 people. So what's the halacha? Mai? Rav Huna says we interpret that still as one person, not to 2. Rav Chisda No, if you just said 1, so 1 could mean 1 and 2, 1 to 100. So the Gemara says, well, say so machlokes. So again, it's a davar pashit. If I say to the shliach, sell off 2 acres to one person and not to 2, obviously I've made my wishes explicitly clear. If I say sell to 1, but I didn't add that last part, so that's the machlokes. So Rav Huna says, no, that means to 1 and not to 2. Rav Chisda Rabba Barafuna, even to 2, even to 100. So we'll say one more piece quickly. Ikal Rav Nachman Surah. So Rav Nachman went to Surah. All the Gabe Rav Chisda Barafuna. Rav Chisda Barafuna came to him. Amrulei Kia Gavna Mai. And they asked him, what do you do in this kind of case? Right? In this kind of case. In other words, they will say, where again, I say to Ruvain, sell off my property to one person. How do we interpret that phrase? So Amr Lahu, Le'echad afilu l'shnayim, le'echad afilu l'meah. To which Rav Nachman responded, oh, that could mean once you're saying to 1, 1 could mean to 1, 1 could mean to 10, 1 could mean to 100. As long as you don't say what? To 1 and not to 2, you're not limited. Amr le afagav d'ta shliach. Would this be true ultimately, again, even if the shaliach made a mistake? Amr lu d'ta shliach lo kamina. To which Rav Nachman said, look at Rashi, afagav d'ta shliach umachar bezol. So would we say the same thing halacha l'maisa? If the shaliach undersold the property, that the shlichus would still be good. Armaluhu de ta shliach lo kamina. To which Rav Nachman said, I'm not talking about a case where the shaliach made a mistake. So we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. So just understand again, we still have our 3 questions outstanding. What happens if the shaliach added on to the parameters of the shlichus? What happens if the shaliach did less than the parameters of the shlichus? And then I will say, in this case of this last question over here, of when the Balabai says shaliach, go ahead and sell a piece of property to a person, does that limit the shaliach from selling it to more than one interested party? Resolution of all 3 of those issues. Emir Hashem B'Shatov Maslachas tomorrow. Shkoyach. Yeah, good mind. Good to see you. Emir Hashem. Amen.